On a brisk Tuesday morning in the Grand Lecture Hall at the University of Michigan, Professor Linda Cartwright prepared to deliver another advanced calculus lecture that had earned a reputation for unyielding discipline and covert disdain for those who did not meet her rigid expectations. Known for her sharp features, silver-rimmed glasses, and icy stare, Professor Cartwright was notorious not only for her uncompromising teaching style, but also for her subtle yet unmistakable racial prejudice that left many minority students feeling marginalized and humiliated. That day, she had arranged a scenario designed to force a brilliant student into failure in front of his peers, and her target was a quiet yet determined young man named Marcus Johnson. Marcus, who dressed modestly in a plain hoodie and jeans, had long been underestimated by his professor because of his background, but his mind worked with a speed and clarity that far surpassed the superficial judgments cast upon him. As Professor Cartwright strode to the front of the room, the click of her high-heeled shoes on the polished floor punctuated the silence, and with a deliberate snap of chalk between her fingers, she began inscribing intricate equations across the board. The room, filled with the low murmur of students and the rustle of worn notebooks, was charged with an atmosphere of both dread and anticipation. In the midst of this oppressive setting, Marcus noticed a subtle yet crucial error in the Laplace transform, a mistake that, if left uncorrected, would later be used as ammunition for the professor's vindictive nature and discriminatory sneers. Summoning all his quiet courage, he raised his hand and calmly informed the class that the transformation had been applied to the wrong term, a correction delivered not out of arrogance, but out of a profound commitment to truth. The professor's eyes narrowed with a flash of irritation that mingled with an unmistakable air of condescension as she dismissed his remark with a sarcastic tone that hinted at deeper biases. Undeterred, Marcus walked confidently to the board and with steady, deliberate strokes erased the error and rewrote the equation correctly. Each movement of his hand was a silent protest against years of injustice and subtle humiliation that had plagued him and his classmates. As he explained his reasoning in a calm, conversational manner that resonated with clarity and authority, a hush fell over the room. Even the slightest sound seemed to echo the gravity of the moment. That single act of correction became the spark for something far larger. In the days that followed, murmurs of discontent grew into a resounding call for accountability. Students, emboldened by Marcus's quiet defiance, shared painful stories of Professor Cartwright's biased treatment and cruel disregard for their dignity. The ensuing investigation uncovered a long history of racial prejudice and academic bullying, and soon the entire department was forced to reckon with the truth. In an act of grand retribution that left the academic community in awe, the professor was ultimately dismissed, her authority shattered by the courageous stand of one man. Marcus Johnson emerged not only as a brilliant mathematician but also as a symbol of resistance against oppression, his measured response forever altering the landscape of the classroom and inspiring countless others to demand fairness and respect. On a crisp fall morning at the University of Michigan, the atmosphere in the lecture hall was heavy with anticipation and unspoken tension. Professor Linda Cartwright, known for her exacting standards and cold, intimidating presence, had just raised the stakes in a way that sent a shiver down everyone's spine. "We raise the stakes?" she had asked, her voice calm but laced with a hint of malice that made even the bravest students pause. A few students chuckled nervously, while others leaned forward, their eyes darting between her and the quiet young man in the back of the room. This young man, now known as Marcus Johnson, had already proven himself by correcting a mistake that Professor Cartwright had stubbornly dismissed earlier. But now the challenge was personal, and it would test not only his intellect, but also his resolve against a professor whose cruelty and deep-seated prejudice had long marred her reputation. Marcus sat quietly as Professor Cartwright walked over to her desk and retrieved a thick, worn textbook from a drawer. With deliberate care, she flipped through the pages until she stopped at a section filled with dense, intimidating equations that far exceeded the material they had been covering in class. Holding the textbook high so that every student could see, she tapped a particularly formidable problem and declared, "This problem is taken from an advanced graduate-level course, something I would never expect an undergraduate to be able to solve." A murmur rippled through the room, part awe, part disbelief, as her cold, calculating eyes fixed on Marcus, when he softly asked, "What do you mean?" His voice was barely audible, but his quiet determination was unmistakable. With a smile that never quite reached her eyes, Professor Cartwright leaned forward and said, "But since you appear to possess a natural talent for this, why don't you prove it?" The challenge was delivered in a tone that mixed condescension with barely concealed hostility. In that moment, Marcus realized that this was no longer just a test of mathematical ability. It was a battle for his dignity. It was clear that Professor Cartwright, whose reputation for brilliance was tainted by her racist and elitist attitudes, was determined to humiliate him publicly. Her challenge was a calculated setup meant to break him, to force him into a position where every mistake would confirm her baseless belief that he was unworthy. Marcus felt the heavy weight of expectation settle on his shoulders. He knew that if he hesitated or refused, it would only prove that her discriminatory assumptions were right. Instead, he exhaled slowly, summoning every ounce of quiet resolve he possessed, and said, "I'm in." For a brief moment, the room was silent, the only sound being the soft shuffle of papers and the faint hum of the air conditioning. Then, with a curt nod, Professor Cartwright's smile reappeared, an expression that concealed more contempt than encouragement. "Excellent," she replied, her tone leaving no room for debate. News of the challenge spread quickly through the corridors as Marcus left the lecture hall. Some students nodded at him with a newfound respect, while others looked at him as if he were about to enter a championship game. There was an electric sense of anticipation in the air, as if everyone knew that something momentous was about to happen. Yet Marcus had bigger concerns on his mind. A prestigious symposium was scheduled to take place in 4 weeks, a competition for which many students had spent months, sometimes years, preparing. Now he had only 4 weeks to ready himself for a contest that would pit him against the brightest mathematical minds in the country. That very night, in the quiet solitude of the campus library, Marcus found refuge among the towering stacks of textbooks and crumpled notes scattered across a small desk. The soft glow of his desk lamp illuminated his determined face as he immersed himself in the intricate world of mathematical theories and proofs. His half-empty coffee cup, now cold and forgotten, sat as silent testimony to his long hours of relentless study. Mathematics had always been his passion, but now it carried a deeper meaning. Each equation he solved, each proof he painstakingly worked through, was a small act of defiance against the injustices he had endured, not just in that lecture hall, but in every dismissive remark and every sneer that had been directed at him because of his background. The next day, as Marcus walked into class, the atmosphere seemed to crackle with a charged intensity. He slid into his usual seat, mentally preparing himself for whatever might come next. When Professor Cartwright entered a few minutes later, her face was as composed and implacable as ever. Yet, as she scanned the room, her eyes eventually landed on Marcus, and for just a fleeting moment something in her expression changed. A subtle hint of reluctant respect, quickly masked by her habitual coolness. Clearing her throat, she addressed the class in a measured tone that barely betrayed any emotion. "Before we begin today's lecture, I would like to acknowledge the results of yesterday's symposium." The room fell into a heavy silence. With neither exuberance nor ceremony, she continued, "Marcus Johnson took first place in a competition against some of the best mathematical minds in the country." A few students clapped softly, and Brian, a student who had long enjoyed Professor Cartwright's favor, shot Marcus a knowing grin. It was a simple acknowledgement delivered without any trace of praise, yet it carried the weight of a hard-won victory that resonated with every listener. For Marcus, the triumph was not merely about proving his intellectual prowess. It was about proving to himself that his worth could not be diminished by prejudice or arrogance. The challenge, originally intended as a means of humiliation, had instead ignited within him a fire of determination that burned brighter than ever. Over the following days, as the initial shock of his victory gave way to a cautious admiration among his peers, the dynamics in the classroom began to shift. Some students whispered excitedly about the possibility of Marcus earning a place in a more advanced class, while others, nursing bruised egos and clinging to old biases, harbored a bitter resentment. Meanwhile, Professor Cartwright maintained a stiff, professional exterior, but behind her carefully controlled demeanor, her inner turmoil was growing. Her cold lectures and terse comments slowly gave way to a subtle yet unmistakable shift in her interactions with Marcus. A grudging recognition of his talent that she could neither fully accept nor openly acknowledge. As the weeks passed and the symposium drew ever nearer, Marcus found himself locked in an intense cycle of preparation. Every afternoon, he secluded himself in the quiet corners of the university library, poring over complex theories and practicing intricate problems until they became second nature. The challenge that had once been meant to break him had instead become the catalyst for a transformation, a metamorphosis of his very spirit. The soft hum of his desk lamp and the persistent scratch of his pen on paper became the soundtrack to his determination. Yet, even as he made progress, a nagging question lingered in his mind. Why had Professor Cartwright chosen him for that cruel challenge? Was it simply to humiliate him in front of his peers? Or was there a more calculated, insidious motive behind her actions? Marcus knew deep down that her challenge was tainted with the same bias and racism that had long defined her treatment of minority students, and this realization added another layer of complexity to his struggle. In the midst of his rigorous studies, whispers began circulating among the student body. Rumors of a final confrontation between Marcus and Professor Cartwright grew louder with each passing day. Many students, tired of the professor's haughty demeanor and her habit of dismissing anyone who did not fit her narrow vision of excellence, eagerly awaited the moment when her cruelty would be exposed for all to see. Meanwhile, Marcus remained steadfast in his focus, using every moment of quiet solitude to build the skills and confidence he would need to face the ultimate test at the upcoming symposium. Then finally the day arrived. 4 weeks later, Marcus found himself standing in a vast auditorium-style lecture hall at the University of Penn. The room was packed with competitors, esteemed judges, and an audience whose anticipation was almost palpable. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest as he took his place among the other participants. A long digital timer loomed above the stage, counting down the seconds to the start of the competition. Competitors were arranged neatly at their desks, each armed with scratch paper and a pen, ready to solve problems with both speed and accuracy. In the audience, Professor Cartwright was present, a constant, imposing reminder of the battles they had fought in the lecture hall. Though her presence was less overtly hostile than before, her eyes burned with an intensity that Marcus recognized all too well. The competition began with a round of mental math, a test of pure calculation that required the participants to solve problems without writing anything down. Many competitors hesitated, their hands trembling as they tried to keep pace with the rapid-fire questions. But Marcus's hands moved with a fluid precision, inputting numbers into the response system faster than the proctors could blink. The next round, focused on theoretical application, required the participants to break down complex concepts into coherent proofs. Here, Marcus's natural intuition shone brightly as he transformed abstract ideas into a series of logical, interconnected statements. His answers were not only correct, but elegantly simple, a testament to his deep understanding of the subject. The final round, known as speed solving, was the most nerve-wracking. In this round, even the most accomplished competitors often faltered under the pressure, second-guessing every step they took. But Marcus, fueled by the memory of every slight and every dismissive remark, pressed on with relentless determination. As the final round neared its end, only 2 competitors remained in serious contention: Marcus Johnson and a PhD candidate from MIT. A formidable opponent in his own right. The last problem appeared on the digital screen, a brutal cascade of layered integrals and nested summations designed to test every ounce of mental endurance. Marcus's pulse steadied as he picked up his pen. He exhaled deeply and began writing, his mind racing through the layers of complexity faster than his pen could capture. Every stroke was deliberate, every calculation a silent protest against the forces of discrimination that had tried to hold him back. In those final moments, as the clock ticked down and the seconds seemed to stretch into eternity, Marcus spotted a pattern, a shortcut that no one else would recognize. His hand moved with a precision and speed that bordered on instinct, slicing through the tangled web of numbers and simplifying the expressions in a way that was both brilliant and unexpected. Without pausing for a single moment to double-check his work, he confidently boxed the final answer and set his pen aside. The timer buzzed, marking the end of the competition, and Marcus looked up, his breathing calm and controlled, even as the tension in the room reached its peak. Although his competitor was still scribbling furiously, the deep silence that had fallen over the auditorium spoke volumes. One of the judges, a renowned mathematician known for his fairness and integrity, rose and approached both competitors. Every answer was scrutinized with meticulous care, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the head judge took center stage and raised his microphone. In recognition of extraordinary talent and unwavering perseverance, he announced, in a clear, resonant voice, "The winner of the 2025 University Mathematics Symposium is Marcus Johnson." The room erupted into a cacophony of cheers, claps, and even gasps of disbelief. For Marcus, the announcement was both a triumph and a bittersweet reminder of the long road he had traveled. He had won not just against his fellow competitors, but against the heavy expectations and the cruelty of a professor who had once tried to diminish him. The next morning, as Marcus entered class and resumed his usual seat, the atmosphere was unrecognizably transformed. Professor Cartwright arrived a few minutes later, her usual composed exterior intact, but this time her eyes, when they met Marcus's, carried a note of reluctant respect. A respect born not of admiration for his conformity, but for the brilliance and resolve that had forced her hand. Clearing her throat, she began the lecture in a tone that was steady and measured. "I would like to acknowledge the results of yesterday's symposium," she said, pausing as the room fell into a reverent silence. "Marcus Johnson took first place in a competition against some of the best mathematical minds in the country." A few students clapped, and even Brian, who had once been her favorite, offered a look that mingled admiration with a trace of regret. Yet the victory was only one chapter in a story that had grown much larger and more complex. In the weeks that followed, as Marcus continued to excel in his studies and his reputation as both a brilliant mathematician and a symbol of perseverance grew, the dark undercurrents of Professor Cartwright's character began to surface in ever more insidious ways. Behind closed doors, she seethed with envy and bitterness, unable to reconcile her own self-picture with the reality that a student she had once intended to humiliate had outshone her at every turn. In hushed tones and private meetings, she made snide remarks about Marcus's abilities, questioning whether his success was truly the product of hard work or merely an inexplicable anomaly. Her venomous comments, often laced with racial slurs and subtle hints of disdain for his background, began to circulate among the faculty. The very foundation of her authority, built on a lifetime of unchecked prejudice and cruelty, started to crumble, as more and more of her colleagues recognized the injustice of her actions. Marcus felt the sting of these betrayals keenly. Every disparaging remark, every dismissive glance cut him deeply, reinforcing the painful reality that he had been judged not by his abilities, but by the color of his skin and the archaic biases of those in power. His journey through mathematics, once a solitary pursuit of beauty and logic, had become a battleground where every step forward was met with resistance. And yet, amid this storm of injustice, Marcus's resolve only grew stronger. He began to see that his success was not just a personal victory, but a beacon for all those who had ever been oppressed or marginalized. With each equation solved in the quiet hours of the night, he was not only conquering complex mathematical challenges, but also dismantling the prejudice barriers that had been imposed upon him. In the quiet solitude of his study sessions, Marcus's thoughts turned increasingly toward a daring plan. A plan not of revenge for revenge's sake, but of righteous retribution. He resolved that he would use the platform his victory had given him to expose the systemic discrimination and the outright cruelty that had defined Professor Cartwright's tenure. His plan was to compile a comprehensive report, one that would detail every instance of bias and humiliation, supported by testimonies from countless students and corroborated by anonymous faculty members who had witnessed her unyielding cruelty firsthand. This report, Marcus believed, would not only vindicate him but also spark a necessary reckoning within the academic community, a turning point that would force the institution to confront its own prejudices. As the final days leading up to the next symposium approached, the campus was awash with whispers of impending change. In quiet corners of the university library, groups of students who had suffered under Professor Cartwright's regime gathered to share their stories. Their accounts of humiliation, isolation, and discrimination painted a damning picture of a system that had long allowed such behavior to fester. The more they talked, the clearer it became that the professor's actions were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger pattern of abuse and exclusion that had harmed countless students over the years. Then came the day of the symposium, a day that would not only test the mettle of the competitors, but also serve as a final stage for the dramatic confrontation that had been building for months. In a packed auditorium at the University of Pennsylvania, Marcus was once again introduced not merely as a brilliant mathematician, but as a symbol of resilience and defiance in the face of deep-seated injustice. The panel of judges was acutely aware of the controversy that had surrounded Professor Cartwright, and the room buzzed with anticipation as the competition began in earnest. The rounds of mental math, theoretical application, and speed solving each carried an added weight that went beyond academic rigor. They were battles in a war against prejudice. With every problem he solved, Marcus sent a clear message that talent and hard work could indeed triumph over the cruel, discriminatory practices that had haunted his academic journey. In the final round, as he again faced a seemingly insurmountable cascade of integrals and nested summations, his focus was absolute. Every formula he jotted down was a defiant statement against the forces that had tried so hard to silence him. His pen moved so swiftly and confidently that it was as if the very act of writing had become an act of liberation. When the final buzzer sounded and the judges began their deliberation, the room was filled with a silence that was almost tangible. Finally, the head judge stepped forward and declared, "In recognition of extraordinary talent, perseverance, and the courage to stand up against discrimination, the winner of this year's symposium is Marcus Johnson." The announcement was met with thunderous applause, cheers, and even tears of relief from those who had long suffered in silence. In that moment, Marcus's victory transcended academic achievement. It became a resounding statement of justice. The cheers that followed were as loud as they were emotional, but amid the jubilation, Marcus felt a profound mixture of elation and sorrow. He had finally emerged victorious, yet the scars of years spent fighting against prejudice were still fresh in his heart. His triumph was bittersweet, a reminder of the heavy toll that discrimination had taken and a promise that the fight for equality was far from over. In the aftermath of the competition, the campus underwent a dramatic transformation. The once formidable Professor Cartwright, whose authority had been built on an edifice of cruelty and bias, now found herself isolated and under intense scrutiny. Rumors of her past transgressions, whispered in hushed tones in faculty lounges and administrative offices, began to gain traction. Faculty members who had once revered her discipline now questioned the integrity of her methods. The evidence of her long-standing racial prejudice was undeniable, and it was only a matter of time before the administration could no longer ignore the mounting pressure for reform. Marcus, now hailed as a hero not just for his mathematical brilliance, but for his unwavering commitment to justice, continued his studies with a quiet strength. Invitations to speak at community events and academic panels poured in, and his story became a rallying cry for those who had suffered under the weight of discrimination. In local coffee shops and community centers, his journey was recounted with warmth and admiration by older women who had themselves faced decades of prejudice. They saw in Marcus a reflection of their own struggles, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, perseverance and integrity could light the way to a better future. Then, in a climactic moment that would forever alter the course of the institution, Marcus arranged a grand public forum. On that day, he presented his groundbreaking mathematical theories to a diverse audience that ranged from local community members to national scholars. But his presentation was not just about numbers and equations. With calm, measured determination, he unveiled the comprehensive report he had been compiling, a report that detailed every instance of Professor Cartwright's discriminatory practices and cruel behavior. The evidence was irrefutable, supported by first-hand testimonies and documented instances of bias. The report sent shockwaves through the academic community and forced the university's Board of Regents to call an emergency meeting. Within hours, Professor Cartwright was relieved of her duties, her career in shambles as the full extent of her cruelty was laid bare for all to see. The news reverberated across campus and beyond, a vindication of Marcus's courage and a powerful statement against a system that had long tolerated injustice. Marcus Johnson's story, from his humble beginnings to his rise as a celebrated mathematician and reluctant champion for equality, had become a timeless legend. A tale of triumph over adversity that would inspire generations to come. In the days, weeks, and months that followed, the campus transformed into a place of genuine inclusion and respect. New policies were implemented to ensure that no student would ever again have to endure the kind of bias and humiliation that Marcus had suffered. The changes were far-reaching, touching every aspect of academic life, and they marked the beginning of a new era, one in which talent, perseverance, and integrity were valued above all else. Marcus, though still bearing the emotional scars of his past, continued his journey with a steady resolve. He knew that his fight was not only for himself, but for every person who had ever been marginalized or silenced. Looking back on those tumultuous months, Marcus often recalled the early days in the lecture hall when a single challenge had set him on a path toward greatness and justice. He remembered the fear, the humiliation, and the cold hard stares of a professor who had tried to break him. Yet he also remembered the quiet determination that had fueled his long nights in the library and the overwhelming support of those who had believed in him. His journey was a powerful reminder that even in the face of entrenched cruelty and prejudice, the truth of one's abilities and the steadfast commitment to one's principles would ultimately shine through. As the legacy of that fateful period took root, Marcus Johnson became more than just a brilliant mathematician. He became a symbol of hope, a beacon for those who had long been denied a fair chance, and a living testament to the power of perseverance. His story was told and retold in community centers, coffee shops, and academic gatherings, where it resonated deeply with those who had experienced similar struggles. For many older women who had weathered decades of discrimination in their own lives, Marcus's tale was a soothing reminder that no matter how dark the times, the light of resilience would always prevail. In the end, the downfall of Professor Cartwright and the transformation of the university were not just isolated incidents. They were part of a larger movement toward justice and equality. Marcus Johnson's journey had become a rallying cry for reform, a vivid illustration that even the most oppressive systems could be dismantled when one person dared to stand up and speak the truth. His courage had sparked a revolution of ideas, one that promised to reshape not only the academic landscape, but also the very fabric of society. And while the scars of the past would always serve as a reminder of the battles fought, they also fueled the hope for a future where every student could flourish without fear of discrimination. Thus, the story of Marcus Johnson stands as a stirring narrative of both triumph and sorrow, a story that continues to inspire and move all who hear it. It is a story of a young man who, against overwhelming odds and the relentless cruelty of a prejudiced authority, rose to claim his rightful place in the world. His legacy, marked by brilliant mathematical achievements and an unyielding commitment to justice, remains a beacon for generations to come, reminding us all that even in the darkest moments, the power of perseverance and truth can light the way to a brighter, more equitable future. On that fateful day, after a long series of trials and challenges, the transformation of the classroom was unmistakable. Professor Cartwright, once a symbol of relentless cruelty and covert racial disdain, shot Marcus Johnson a look that conveyed both grudging admiration and seething envy, though the anger in her eyes hinted at a deep-seated bitterness. She turned back to the board and calmly said, "Let's begin." The silence that followed was charged with unspoken truths and a recognition that nothing would ever be the same. It was the sound of undeniable justice, a quiet affirmation that brilliance could triumph over prejudice and tyranny. In the days and weeks following his triumphant win at the National Mathematics Symposium, the once tense classroom atmosphere began to shift dramatically. Students who had once whispered harsh criticisms or nursed their resentments now regarded Marcus with a mix of awe and respect. They saw in him not merely a gifted mathematician, but a courageous soul who had risen above an environment steeped in racial bias and condescension. Even those who had quietly supported Professor Cartwright's harsh methods began to question their own complicity as the undeniable evidence of her biased treatment surfaced. Marcus, whose perseverance had become a rallying cry for the marginalized, soon found himself at the forefront of this movement for change. His comprehensive report detailing the systematic injustices inflicted by Professor Cartwright was published to widespread acclaim. At community forums and local gatherings, his story was recounted with deep emotion and reverence by many, including older women who had battled discrimination for decades. In that moment, Marcus Johnson's victory was not only a personal triumph but a monumental turning point, a clear declaration that every student, regardless of background, deserved to pursue knowledge free from fear and prejudice. The legacy of that transformative day served as a powerful reminder that courage and truth will always prevail over oppression, lighting the way toward a future built on fairness and respect.